Right after the judge finalized our divorce, my mother-in-law cornered me in the courthouse hallway. "Do not ever set foot in my house again. Get out and stay out," she hissed, her face flushed with toxic victory. I looked at her, then at my ex-husband, and let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. "Actually," I replied, my voice echoing off the cold marble walls, "I already sold that house for cash this morning. Oh, and I just fired your son as CEO. My name is Megan. I am 33 years old, and before that deeply satisfying moment of absolute justice, I thought I had a normal, loving marriage. I had no idea the people I called family were actively plotting to throw me away like yesterday's garbage." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your kindness mistaken for weakness, only to prove everyone wrong in the end. Let us skip the long, drawn-out backstory and jump straight into the absolute nightmare that started my awakening. It all began when I returned home from a highly confidential venture capital conference in London 3 days earlier than planned. The Seattle sky was pouring freezing rain, a typical gray, miserable afternoon that perfectly matched my severe jet lag. As my private town car pulled into the long, winding driveway of my $1.5 million suburban home, my heart abruptly dropped into my stomach. Scattered across the wet, muddy asphalt completely exposed to the elements were dozens of heavy black trash bags. They were hastily tied, and several of them had ripped open against the rough pavement. I pressed my face against the cold glass of the car window, squinting through the heavy rain. My breath caught in my throat. Lying in the muddy puddles were my expensive designer clothes, my favorite cashmere sweaters, and my carefully curated collection of shoes. But what made my blood run entirely cold was seeing the contents of the third bag. Highly confidential work documents, physical portfolios, and investment prospectuses from my firm were getting completely soaked in the relentless rain. These were documents that held the financial futures of dozens of startups treated with zero regard. I paid my driver, grabbed the single leather bag that held my secure work laptop, and practically ran toward the shelter of the front porch. The icy rain soaked through my tailored blazer, but I barely registered the cold. I jammed my key into the brass lock of the front door, my mind racing with 100 terrifying scenarios. Had we been robbed? Had someone broken in and ransacked the place? But before the heavy oak door even swung completely open, a deafening, violent sound hit me. It was the brutal, rhythmic crashing of sledgehammers slamming repeatedly against thick drywall. I rushed into the grand foyer, my wet shoes squeaking loudly against the pristine hardwood floors. A thick cloud of white drywall dust hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. Standing right in the middle of the hallway, completely unfazed by the chaos, was my 60-year-old mother-in-law, Beatrice. She was dressed in one of her typical overly bright pantsuits, aggressively pointing a manicured finger at a bewildered contractor who was covered head to toe in white dust. "Knock it all down right now," Beatrice barked, her shrill voice cutting effortlessly through the loud noise of the heavy demolition. "The baby needs a massive playroom, and I want that ugly, depressing desk gone by tomorrow morning. Do not leave a single trace of her miserable aesthetic in that room." They were destroying my home office. The private soundproof sanctuary where I conducted global financial deals and managed millions of dollars was being reduced to absolute rubble right in front of my eyes. "What on earth is going on here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a potent mixture of absolute shock and rising rage. The contractor immediately lowered his sledgehammer, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Beatrice spun around, her eyes widening for only a fraction of a second before twisting into a cruel, triumphant smirk. She did not look guilty. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. "You are home early," she noted, smoothing down her blouse and sounding completely unbothered by the sheer destruction of my personal property. "It is a shame you had to see this part of the process, but I suppose it saves us a phone call later." Before I could even demand an explanation for her insane behavior, the French doors leading to the kitchen swung open. Out walked my husband of 5 years, Bradley. He was 36, the supposed self-made CEO of an emerging tech startup, and the man I truly thought I would spend the rest of my natural life with. But he was not walking alone. His fingers were tightly intertwined with those of Brittany, his 24-year-old administrative assistant. Brittany was wearing one of my expensive silk robes, the fabric draped loosely over her frame. Her stomach had the unmistakable pronounced curve of a late-term pregnancy. She took one look at me standing there dripping wet in the dusty hallway, let out a high-pitched giggle, and shamelessly buried her face into Bradley's shoulder as if I were the intruder disrupting their peaceful afternoon. Bradley froze in his tracks, his face instantly turning a sickly, terrified shade of pale. "Megan," he stammered, stepping slightly in front of Brittany in a pathetic attempt to shield his pregnant mistress from my gaze. "This is not what it looks like. We can sit down and explain everything to you calmly." Bradley, who loved to parade around Seattle telling everyone he was a self-made tech titan, looked like a frightened little boy hiding behind his mother's skirt. I stared at his trembling hands, remembering all the late nights I had stayed up helping him structure his business pitches, all the sacrifices I had silently made to ensure his fragile ego remained intact. He had spent the last 3 years telling me we were too busy building our empire to start a family, claiming his startup needed all our focus and energy. Meanwhile, he was busy playing house with his young assistant on the side, creating the very family he told me we had to delay. Beatrice did not give him the chance to spin his web of lies. She stepped right up to me, completely invading my personal space. Her heavy, expensive perfume warred sickeningly with the smell of the wet drywall dust. She had never liked me, always viewing me as a plain, uninteresting financial worker who was not stylish or wealthy enough for her precious son. She genuinely believed Bradley was the sole provider, the brilliant mind keeping us afloat. "There is absolutely nothing left to explain," Beatrice declared loudly, making sure the contractors could hear every single humiliating word. "Brittany is carrying the beautiful, healthy heir to this family. Something you have spectacularly failed to provide. A barren coattail riding wife like you has no place here anymore. Do not just stand there staring like an idiot. I told the contractors to throw your trash on the driveway because we do not want your negative energy infecting the baby's new environment. Hand over your house keys right now and walk away quietly. We packed your pathetic things in bags where they belong. Now get out of my house." I stood perfectly still in the center of the dusty foyer. Any other woman might have dropped to her knees in pure agony. Any normal person might have screamed until her throat bled, thrown the nearest heavy object, or begged for a rational explanation. Instead, an absolute terrifying composure washed over my entire body. The initial shock evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity that slowed my heart rate down to a steady, rhythmic beat. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of an inch of weakness. I simply looked at the three of them, studying their smug faces like I was evaluating a particularly risky and doomed corporate merger. Bradley, severely mistaking my stunned silence for pathetic submission, suddenly found his misplaced courage. He puffed out his chest, deliberately, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt, a shirt paid for by the generous salary I essentially approved. He stepped forward, radiating the kind of unchecked narcissistic arrogance that only a deeply mediocre man with a fragile ego could possibly muster. "Look, Megan," he began, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Let us just be rational adults about this. I am a self-made tech CEO. I am building a massive legacy. You are just a low-level financial consultant pushing papers at a desk. We are simply in completely different leagues now. Brittany needs a stable, prosperous environment for the baby, and honestly, you have been dragging my potential down for years." I maintained my steady, unblinking gaze, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking away. He shifted his weight nervously under my silent scrutiny, but blindly pushed forward with his clearly rehearsed speech. "I am not a monster," he continued, pulling a sleek leather checkbook from his jacket pocket with a dramatic flourish. I will write you a check right now for $5,000. That is more than enough for a deposit on a nice little studio apartment somewhere closer to your downtown cubicle. But make no mistake, Megan, this house is mine. I pay the gas bills. I pay the electricity and the internet. I am the provider here. You have zero legal rights to this property. Take the money, pack whatever is left of your cheap clothes out there in the mud, and walk away before things get messy in court. The sheer audacity of his legal ignorance was almost physically staggering. He genuinely believed that setting up an automatic payment for the monthly water bill somehow magically granted him supreme ownership of a $1.5 million piece of prime suburban real estate. I looked at the flimsy piece of paper he was holding out to me. $5,000. He sincerely thought $5,000 was a generous severance package for 5 years of marriage and unwavering loyalty. I did not argue. I did not attempt to correct his laughable, embarrassing misunderstanding of asset protection and property law. I did not defend my career or my worth. I simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. I ignored his outstretched hand and the insulting check completely. Instead, I reached down and picked up the single item in that house that actually mattered to me, my heavy encrypted leather work bag containing my secure corporate laptop. "Fine," I said. My voice was eerily quiet, completely void of emotion, carrying no trace of the absolute devastation they so desperately wanted to see. I turned on my heel, my wet shoes squeaking one last time against the drywall-dusted hardwood, and walked out the grand front door. I stepped off the covered porch and walked right back into the freezing, relentless Seattle rain. Behind me, the toxic chorus immediately erupted into celebration. Beatrice let out a loud, cackling laugh that echoed aggressively down the quiet, affluent suburban street. "Look at her run away with her tail between her legs," she taunted, her voice shrill, cruel, and victorious. "Enjoy your miserable studio apartment, you pathetic, barren loser. Do not forget your trash on the way out." Brittany chimed in right on cue, giggling loudly while clinging possessively to Bradley's arm. "Bye, Megan. Thanks for keeping the house warm for us." They stood tightly together on the dry, brightly lit porch, looking for all the world like a picture-perfect united family, celebrating the permanent banishment of an unwanted pest. They watched me trudge through the muddy puddles, ignoring the bags of ruined clothes scattered across the asphalt. The heavy rain quickly soaked my hair and plastered my tailored clothes to my freezing skin, but I kept my back straight and my head held high. They truly believed they had completely destroyed me. They thought I was walking away, a broken, destitute, humiliated woman with absolutely nothing left to my name. My private town car was still idling at the end of the long driveway, the headlights cutting through the dark, stormy afternoon. My driver, seeing me approach in the pouring rain, hurriedly stepped out with a large black umbrella, holding open the heavy door of the luxury vehicle. I slid into the expansive back seat, the door closing with a solid, comforting thud that instantly muted the sounds of the storm and the distant mocking laughter of my former family. The interior of the car was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of expensive leather and quiet success. I sank back against the plush seat, finally alone. I wiped a single drop of cold rain from my cheek and looked directly forward at the privacy partition. They honestly think I am just a low-level consultant. They think I spend my days crunching basic numbers for middle management scrambling to survive on a meager paycheck. They have absolutely no idea who they just kicked out into the rain. I am not a low-level employee. I am the managing partner and majority shareholder of an elite multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm based right here in the city. I control the financial destinies of hundreds of tech companies across the globe. Bradley struts around calling himself a self-made titan, but the truth is entirely different. I am the apex predator in the corporate food chain he so desperately wants to climb. And starting right now, the gloves are completely off. As the town car glided smoothly away from the curb, leaving my soon-to-be ex-husband and his cheering squad behind in the freezing rain, I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. The screen was cracked from the hasty exit, but the device worked perfectly fine. I scrolled past the missed calls from my office and dialed a highly secure number saved under a generic name. It rang only twice before a crisp, professional voice answered the line. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I needed swift, brutal efficiency. Alexander Vase said, my voice steady and commanding. We are executing the suburban property exit strategy immediately. Alexander was my private wealth manager and lead asset attorney. He managed the extensive labyrinth of blind trusts, offshore accounts, and holding companies that kept my personal wealth completely shielded from the public eye and, more importantly, from Bradley's greedy grasp. Understood, Megan, Alexander replied without a single hint of surprise. Has there been a change in your marital status? Bradley just kicked me out of the house, I stated flatly, watching the windshield wipers battle the relentless downpour. He brought his pregnant administrative assistant home, had Beatrice order a demolition crew to destroy my office, and offered me $5,000 to disappear because he genuinely believes he owns the property outright. A low, dark chuckle came through the speaker. Alexander knew the meticulous legal trap I had set years ago. The $1.5 million house did not belong to Bradley. It never had. 3 years before I even met him, I purchased the property in full, entirely in cash, through a blind limited liability company. I was the sole proprietor and absolute owner of that LLC. When Bradley and I got married, his fragile masculine ego demanded that he be the primary provider. He insisted on handling the housing costs to prove his dominance as a rising star in the tech sector. I knew fighting him would only lead to endless, exhausting arguments, so I allowed him to pay the monthly water, electricity, and gas bills, letting him build a completely fabricated fantasy of homeownership. His name was nowhere on the deed. He was, in the strict eyes of the law, nothing more than a glorified tenant, paying the utility companies to keep the lights on. He thinks his name on the broadband bill gives him supreme domain. I continued, staring out at the blurred city lights as we merged onto the crowded highway. I want to correct that massive misconception as rapidly as legally possible. What are your exact instructions? Alexander asked, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing faintly in the background as he pulled up my extensive portfolio files. List the property immediately, I ordered, leaning back heavily against the plush leather headrest. I want an off-market cash sale exclusively targeted to commercial developers. There is a firm that has been aggressively trying to buy up that specific block for the last 2 years to build luxury townhomes. Contact their acquisitions director directly. Tell them the property is finally theirs if they can close the deal and wire the funds by Monday morning. They will want to demolish the existing structure entirely, Alexander noted smoothly, anticipating the logistics. That is exactly the point, I replied, my tone devoid of any sentimental attachment to the building. Fast-track all the closing documents. Waive the standard inspection periods. Pay whatever premium is required to push the paperwork through the county clerk's office at breakneck speed. But here is the most vital instruction, Alexander. Do not alert the current occupants under any circumstances. Bradley, his mother, and his little mistress are not to receive a single notice, warning, or hint until the new owners show up with the bulldozers. Let them gleefully decorate their precious nursery. Let them pick out pastel paint colors and assemble cribs. They are currently standing on borrowed time and my property. Consider it done, he said. The listing will be active within the hour, and I will contact the developers personally. Anything else for tonight? I took a deep, centering breath. The house was merely the appetizer in this banquet of consequences. The main course required a much heavier, far more devastating weapon. It was time to unleash the corporate guillotine I had been quietly holding over Bradley's head for our entire marriage. Yes, I said, a dangerous edge creeping into my voice. Pull the complete corporate files on Bradley's tech company. It is time to review our proxy holdings. Bradley loved to stand on brightly lit stages at local tech mixers, boasting loudly to anyone who would listen about how he pulled his startup up by its bootstraps. He constantly painted himself as a brilliant, relentless visionary who defied the terrible odds and conquered the ruthless tech industry purely through his own unparalleled intellect. The reality was a pathetic, carefully managed illusion that I had personally funded. 4 years ago, barely a year into our marriage, Bradley's company was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. He was completely out of his depth, drowning in massive operational debt, and mere weeks away from filing for absolute bankruptcy. He came home every single night in a state of sheer panic, throwing childish temper tantrums and blaming his developers for his own gross mismanagement. I could not stand watching him spiral into depression, but I also knew his toxic pride would never allow him to accept direct financial help from his wife. He needed to believe he was the hero who saved himself, so I saved him from the deep shadows. I used a proxy holding firm, a quiet subsidiary of my primary venture capital corporation, to aggressively swoop in and provide a massive injection of Series B funding. The rescue package kept his doors open, paid his staff, and allowed his company to eventually stabilize and turn a minor profit. But venture capital is never charity. In exchange for the financial rescue, my holding firm acquired a 51% controlling stake in his entire operation. Bradley greedily signed the term sheets without ever bothering to look into the actual ownership structure of the proxy firm that saved him. He was far too relieved to keep his fancy CEO title to care who actually owned the board. He spent the next 4 years bragging about his genius corporate pivot, completely oblivious to the fact that his plain, boring wife was the silent board chair pulling the heavy strings behind the curtain. I literally owned him. I owned his company, his intellectual property, and his daily paycheck. Alexander Weiss said, staring fiercely at the rain beating against the glass. I want a full microscopic audit initiated on Bradley's corporate account starting tonight. I want every single expense report, every corporate card transaction, and every vendor payout heavily scrutinized. He has grown incredibly careless. He has gotten wildly arrogant, and arrogant men always make fatal, easily traceable mistakes. I will deploy the shadow audit team immediately. Alexander confirmed, his voice matching my cold determination. We will comb through every ledger. If there is a single cent out of place, we will find it and document it. Find it, I commanded, because when I bring him down, I am not just taking back my house. I am taking his company, his precious title, and his entire professional reputation. I want him legally and financially ruined. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my damp pocket. The rain pounded violently against the roof of the car, but inside it was perfectly silent. I had walked out of that house with only the clothes on my back and my laptop. Bradley thought he had stripped me of my dignity and my home. He thought he held all the power. He had absolutely no idea that he was a mere puppet dancing on a stage I built, and I held the scissors directly over his strings. I spent the night in a 5-star luxury hotel downtown, far removed from the petty suburban nightmare I had just left behind. The next morning, the severe storm had finally cleared, leaving the crisp Seattle skyline bright and sharp outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite. I stood comfortably in a plush white cotton robe, sipping a perfectly brewed dark roast espresso, quietly watching the busy city move far below me. The contrast between my actual life and the pathetic narrative Bradley had constructed for me was almost comical. I was just about to open my secure corporate laptop to check Alexander's overnight progress on the proxy audit, when my private encrypted phone violently vibrated against the cool marble of the kitchen island. It was an urgent text message from an entirely unexpected number, the high-resolution screen illuminated with a single name: Jamal. Jamal was 34 years old, a brilliant African-American corporate auditor, and unequivocally the only decent human being in Bradley's entire extended family. Unfortunately for him, he was married to Bradley's younger sister, Courtney. Courtney was deeply spoiled, aggressively lazy, and fully subscribed to the same toxic narcissistic family dynamic that Beatrice had successfully cultivated for decades. Jamal was constantly belittled by Beatrice and Courtney for being a boring pencil pusher, while they treated Bradley like a conquering hero. Despite the constant blatant disrespect, Jamal possessed a rigid, unwavering ethical compass. The message on my screen was brief, urgent, and highly unusual. Megan, I know what happened yesterday. We need to talk immediately. Please tell me you are somewhere safe. It is strictly about Bradley's company. I set my espresso down and dialed his number instantly. He answered on the very first ring, his voice hushed, strained and tight with genuine anxiety. I could hear a television playing faintly in the background, indicating he was clearly hiding somewhere private away from his demanding wife. "Megan, I am so incredibly sorry about what Bradley did to you yesterday," he whispered rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. "It is completely unforgivable. But you need to put that aside and listen to me very carefully right now." Bradley casually asked me to do a quiet off-the-books review of his startup financials last week. He claimed he wanted me to help him prepare some early quarterly tax projections completely off the official record. I started digging deeply into his main operating ledger last night, and Megan, it is exceptionally bad. It is a catastrophic financial black hole. I kept my voice carefully neutral, forcefully suppressing the sudden surge of absolute victory rising in my chest. "What exactly did you find in the ledger, Jamal?" I asked, calmly feigning innocent confusion. I could hear him pacing frantically back and forth in his room. "Corporate embezzlement," he breathed, the heavy legal term hanging in the digital space between us. "Massive systemic embezzlement." He has been silently siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of his primary corporate operating accounts. He is actively hiding the cash transfers under a complex web of fake vendor invoices and highly bloated marketing expenditures. If his investors or his board of directors ever find out about this massive breach of trust, they will absolutely crucify him. He is looking at severe federal wire fraud charges. He did not just take a little cash off the top to cover a bad month. Jamal continued, his panic escalating rapidly on my behalf. He systematically routed over $900,000 into a secondary hidden shell account. Megan, he used those stolen corporate funds to purchase a luxury downtown condominium completely in cash. And the property deed is registered entirely in Beatrice's name. That is not all. There are dozens of unauthorized corporate credit card charges routed directly to high-end designer clothing boutiques, luxury jewelers, and five-star wellness spas. He has been fully funding Brittany's entire lavish lifestyle using stolen investor money. He is completely bleeding his own startup dry just to play the wealthy, generous benefactor for his mother and his pregnant mistress. "I desperately need you to take these audit trails right now," Jamal urged frantically. "I am sending the fully encrypted financial files to your personal email address as we speak. Take them straight to a ruthless, aggressive divorce attorney today. Bradley is absolutely going to try to hide his remaining assets and claim he is cash poor to avoid giving you a fair and equitable settlement. You can successfully use this illicit paper trail as massive legal leverage to force him to pay you proper alimony and secure a decent place to live. Do not let him bully you out of what you rightfully deserve, Megan. I am absolutely terrified of what will happen to Courtney and my young daughter if this massive scandal blows up publicly, but I cannot simply sit back and watch him leave you completely destitute on the street." As the heavily encrypted data files pinged securely into my inbox, I quickly opened them on my laptop screen. The financial data was beautifully and clearly organized, a stunning testament to Jamal's meticulous skill as a senior auditor. Every single fake invoice was brightly highlighted, every illicit cash transfer clearly traced straight back to Bradley's specific executive authorization codes. The sheer unbridled arrogance of the theft was breathtaking to witness. Bradley honestly believed he was somehow smart enough to casually outwit the strict financial safeguards of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. He treated the company treasury like his own personal checking account, fully convinced that his inflated CEO title made him completely invincible to any oversight. Jamal's detailed forensic analysis had just saved my own proxy audit team weeks of tedious, exhausting accounting work. I looked at the beautiful morning sunlight reflecting warmly off the penthouse marble countertops, a slow, dangerous smile finally returning to my face. Jamal was bravely risking his own fragile marriage and his spotless professional reputation to aggressively protect a woman he truly thought was a helpless, low-level financial consultant facing imminent homelessness. He was handing me the exact ammunition I needed to aggressively negotiate a measly studio apartment settlement. He had absolutely no idea that he had just willingly handed the silent board chair of Bradley's tech company the precise, undeniable, and legally ironclad evidence required to execute a catastrophic corporate firing. I immediately texted Jamal back, instructing him to meet me in exactly 1 hour at an exclusive, ultra-secure coffee shop tucked away in the financial district. It was a place heavily frequented by elite bankers and high-profile executives far outside the suburban bubble where his toxic wife and mother-in-law spent their miserable days. When I arrived, Jamal was already sitting nervously at a secluded corner booth, clutching a small black leather satchel tightly to his chest. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting around the sophisticated room, as if expecting Beatrice to suddenly materialize from behind an espresso machine. I slid smoothly into the leather booth across from him, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered calm. He quickly reached into his satchel and slid a small encrypted metallic flash drive across the polished mahogany table. "This is the raw data, Megan," he whispered, looking around nervously. "The original source files untouched by Bradley's manipulated accounting software." I took the flash drive and slipped it securely into my designer handbag. "Thank you, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "What you did today took an incredible amount of courage. I know exactly how that family operates, and I know how heavily they rely on absolute, unquestioning loyalty." He let out a long, heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "I just could not sleep a single wink last night," he openly confessed, nervously stirring his untouched coffee. "Watching Courtney and Beatrice laugh about how you were thrown out into the rain like garbage made me physically sick. You never deserved any of their cruelty." I leaned forward, looking directly into his tired, honest eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, Jamal. A massive, unstoppable hurricane is about to hit that entire family, and it is going to wipe them completely off the map. You need to keep your head down. Do not confront Courtney. Do not challenge Beatrice. Continue acting exactly as you always do. When the storm finally makes landfall and destroys everything they have built, I personally promise to shield you entirely from the devastating financial and legal fallout. You and your daughter will be completely protected." He looked at me with deep confusion, clearly wondering how a supposedly broke financial consultant could possibly protect him from a multi-million-dollar corporate collapse. But he simply nodded, entirely unaware of the absolute truth. I returned straight to the quiet isolation of my penthouse suite, securely locked the heavy double doors, and immediately plugged Jamal's flash drive into my encrypted corporate laptop. I opened a highly secure communication channel with Alexander and my primary venture capital audit team. We spent the entire night meticulously cross-referencing Jamal's raw accounting data directly against the strict internal investment metrics my venture capital firm legally required Bradley's company to maintain for compliance. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was far worse than even Jamal had initially realized. Bradley was not just siphoning operational cash to fund a luxury lifestyle. He had committed a massive systematic fiduciary breach that touched every single department of his supposed tech empire. We uncovered a dense, tangled web of heavily falsified vendor contracts. Bradley had actively created 5 separate fake shell companies, completely registered them under Brittany's maiden name, and aggressively billed his own startup hundreds of thousands of dollars for completely fictitious digital marketing services that were never actually rendered. He then routed that stolen investor capital straight into private offshore accounts to hide it from both the IRS and me. He had brazenly gambled with the financial livelihoods of his hardworking employees just to maintain his pathetic facade of limitless wealth. Every single document I reviewed only fueled the cold, calculated anger burning quietly in my chest. He had stolen from my venture capital firm. He had stolen from his own loyal staff. He had stolen my time, my trust, and my absolute dedication. But instead of letting anger blind me, I let it sharpen my focus into a deadly surgical precision. By 4 a.m, my legal team had compiled an exhaustive, irrefutable mountain of digital evidence, proving undeniable corporate fraud, gross negligence, and severe fiduciary misconduct. The most dangerous weapon in any war is strategic absolute silence. Any other scorned wife would have immediately marched over to that suburban house, violently kicked down the front door, and screamed the truth into Bradley's arrogant face. They would have desperately demanded immediate justice and validation. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I did not confront Bradley. I did not send him a single angry text message or answer any of his patronizing phone calls. I completely ghosted him and his entire toxic family. I deliberately chose to let him continue living in his fragile, fabricated fantasy world. I wanted him to feel completely victorious. I wanted him to keep violently swiping those stolen corporate credit cards, buying expensive baby furniture for Brittany, and loudly bragging to his country club friends about his ruthless business acumen. Every single dollar he stole over the next few days would only serve to dig his federal grave significantly deeper. I calmly packaged the massive mountain of forensic accounting evidence into two highly secure, heavily encrypted digital dossiers. I forwarded the first comprehensive packet directly to the local division of the FBI White-Collar Crime Unit, completely bypassing local law enforcement, to ensure an immediate federal investigation into the massive wire fraud. I forwarded the second packet straight to my elite corporate legal team at the venture capital firm. I gave them strict, uncompromising instructions to quietly draft the immediate termination papers, authorize total asset freezes, and prepare massive civil clawback lawsuits. Everything was officially locked-loaded and silently waiting in the dark for the exact right moment to strike. My trap was perfectly set, and Bradley was completely oblivious to the massive storm forming directly over his head. I was not just going to divorce him. I was going to surgically dismantle his entire existence. The following morning, I stepped out of my private town car and looked up at the towering glass and steel skyscraper housing my venture capital firm. For 5 years, Bradley believed I worked in a cramped cubicle on the second floor of a miserable accounting building. He never bothered to visit my actual office, completely blinded by his own narcissism. He never asked about my day, assuming my career was utterly insignificant compared to his self-proclaimed genius. Today, the audience finally gets to see the real me. I walked through the massive revolving doors and strode across the polished marble lobby. Security guards immediately straightened their posture and nodded respectfully as I passed. I swiped my platinum access card and stepped into the private executive elevator, pressing the button for the 40th floor. When the silver doors slid open, I stepped into my true element. The 40th floor was a sprawling, silent fortress of absolute financial power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. Sleek modern art hung on the walls, and a team of highly paid analysts moved quietly through the corridors. I walked straight down the main hallway toward the primary executive boardroom. My assistant simply opened the heavy frosted glass doors for me as I approached. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with intense anticipation. Sitting around the massive custom-built black walnut table were the 5 senior members of the proxy board I had installed to oversee Bradley's company 4 years ago. These were ruthless, highly experienced corporate titans who routinely dismantled failing corporations before their morning coffee. Alexander, my lead asset attorney, was already standing at the head of the table, his tablet connected to the massive digital projector screen dominating the far wall. I took my seat at the absolute center of the table, the undisputed chairwoman of the board. The room fell completely silent. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying the cold, commanding authority that Bradley had never once heard. 4 years ago, we authorized a massive Series B rescue package to save a severely mismanaged tech startup from total bankruptcy. We took a 51% controlling stake under a proxy holding company to protect our primary firm from potential reputational damage. At the time, we believed the chief executive officer simply required structural guidance. We were wrong. He is not just incompetent, he is a criminal. I nodded to Alexander. He tapped his screen and the massive projector illuminated the darkened room. Detailed financial spreadsheets, intercepted wire transfers, and forged vendor invoices flashed across the screen in brutal, high definition. I walked the board meticulously through every single piece of evidence Jamal and my audit team had compiled overnight. I showed them the stolen corporate funds routed to Beatrice's luxury condo. I displayed the exorbitant designer shopping sprees funded by completely fabricated digital marketing invoices. I exposed the hidden offshore accounts Bradley had desperately tried to conceal. The reaction in the room was immediate and absolute. These board members did not care about my personal marital drama. They cared about the blatant theft of our investors' capital. The sheer scale of the embezzlement is a severe violation of every single compliance metric we enforce. I continued pacing slowly behind my leather chair. He has exposed this proxy firm to massive federal liability. He has treated our capital injection as his own personal slush fund. But more importantly, he has triggered the strict fiduciary breach and morality clauses explicitly written into his employment contract. I projected the specific legal clauses onto the screen. The morality clause clearly stated that any action bringing public disgrace, severe legal scrutiny, or financial ruin to the company resulted in immediate termination with zero severance. The fiduciary breach clause allowed the board to instantly seize all corporate assets, freeze his professional accounts, and sue him personally for the exact amount stolen. I looked around the table, making direct eye contact with every single board member. I am calling for an immediate unanimous vote to completely sever the chief executive officer from the company, I stated firmly. We will invoke the morality clause to deny him any exit compensation. We will invoke the fiduciary breach to authorize our legal department to aggressively pursue total financial restitution. We will draft the immediate termination papers, execute the total asset freezes, and file the civil clawback lawsuits today. Do I have a motion to vote? The senior board member to my right did not even hesitate. I motion to vote, he said coldly. The second followed instantly. Within less than 60 seconds, the vote was completely unanimous. Bradley was officially, legally, and permanently fired from the company he claimed to have built from the ground up. He had absolutely no idea that a room full of strangers, led by the wife he had just thrown out into the rain, had just surgically removed his entire professional existence. Alexander immediately began distributing the thick stacks of official legal paperwork to the board members for their required signatures. These documents give us the absolute authority to lock him out of every single corporate system, Alexander explained, sliding the final termination notice across the table toward me. We can remotely wipe his company phone, disable his security badges, and freeze his corporate banking access the moment you give the final order. I picked up the heavy gold pen sitting on the table and signed my name directly on the bottom line of Bradley's termination notice. But I did not hand the paperwork back to Alexander immediately. I let my hand rest on the documents, a dangerous, calculated strategy forming perfectly in my mind. Bradley had humiliated me publicly. He had paraded his pregnant mistress in front of me and allowed his mother to orchestrate a theatrical eviction. Simply firing him quietly on a Wednesday morning was far too merciful. I needed maximum undeniable devastation. Hold the execution of these documents, I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Do not file the termination notice. Do not execute the asset freezes. Do not trigger the digital lockouts. You are to hold all of this paperwork in a completely secure sealed file. The board members looked at me in slight confusion. Alexander raised an eyebrow, sensing the lethal trap I was carefully setting. When exactly do you want the execution order given? He asked smoothly. Next Tuesday, I replied, a cold smile touching my lips. Exactly at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not a minute sooner. Not a minute later. Tuesday at 3 o'clock was the exact date and time of my scheduled divorce mediation hearing. Bradley was going to walk into that courthouse completely arrogant, demanding I sign away my entire life for a miserable $5,000 check. He was going to believe he held every single advantage, and right at the very moment he thought he had won everything right, when he felt completely invincible, I was going to drop the guillotine directly on his neck. Understood, Alexander said, gathering the signed documents and placing them into a heavily secured leather briefcase. Tuesday at 3 o'clock. The system lockouts will be entirely automated and instantaneous. I dismissed the board and stood alone in the quiet boardroom, looking out over the sprawling city of Seattle. Down there, somewhere in the affluent suburbs, Bradley was likely waking up in his heavily mortgaged bed, completely convinced he was a self-made titan who had successfully discarded a useless wife. He was probably planning his new nursery and checking his stolen bank balances. He had absolutely no idea that his entire empire was already reduced to ashes, and I was just waiting for the perfect audience to finally show him the absolute wreckage. 2 days later, the relentless Seattle rain finally gave way to a deceptively bright Saturday morning. My elite legal team had informed me that local jurisdiction required me to physically serve Bradley with a specific set of preliminary financial disclosure requests ahead of our scheduled Tuesday mediation. Bradley, in a completely calculated move to maximize my discomfort, insisted I deliver the documents to him directly at the sprawling suburban country club his family frequented. Beatrice was hosting a ridiculously extravagant, fully catered brunch in one of the private dining rooms to officially celebrate Courtney opening her brand new luxury wellness spa. It was the perfect stage for them to flaunt their stolen wealth, and they desperately wanted me there strictly to serve as the impoverished peasant witnessing their royal triumph. I pulled my private vehicle up to the sweeping circular driveway of the country club. The valet rushed forward to open my door, completely unaware of the absolute corporate bloodbath I had orchestrated just 48 hours prior. I stepped out wearing a stunningly simple, impeccably tailored black designer dress. To anyone with actual wealth, the garment screamed quiet luxury and raw power. But to Beatrice and her circle of desperately flashy suburban socialites, it likely just looked like a plain, unbranded bargain bin find. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the club, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble lobby, gripping the thick legal folder in my left hand. I bypassed the main dining area and headed straight for the private sunroom overlooking the pristine 18th hole. The moment I pushed open the double doors, the overwhelming stench of cheap champagne, expensive floral arrangements, and pure, unadulterated entitlement hit me like a physical wall. The room was packed with Beatrice's obnoxious friends, all wearing brightly colored sundresses and massive sun hats. A massive banner hung across the far wall, congratulating Courtney on her grand opening. In the center of the room, Beatrice was holding court loudly, dictating orders to the club waitstaff while balancing a crystal mimosa glass. Brittany was seated comfortably at the head table, aggressively rubbing her pregnant belly, while Bradley stood right behind her looking like a proud, conquering hero. Courtney was busy posing for photographs in front of a massive ice sculpture shaped like a lotus flower. It took exactly 4 seconds for Beatrice to spot me standing quietly near the entrance. Her eyes instantly narrowed into predatory slits. She did not hesitate to publicly weaponize my arrival. "Well, well, look who just crawled out of the gutter," Beatrice announced, her shrill voice, intentionally projecting loud enough to bring the entire room of chattering women to a dead, uncomfortable silence. Every single head turned in my direction. Beatrice took a long, exaggerated sip of her mimosa and looked me up and down with theatrical disgust. "I honestly did not think you would actually show your face here, Megan. I suppose your pathetic little studio apartment does not have a working kitchen. Are you just here because you want some free food?" A low chorus of cruel, mocking laughter rippled through the room. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I slowly walked directly toward the center table, moving with the terrifying calm of a predator, silently stalking a completely oblivious herd. Courtney eagerly stepped away from her ridiculous ice sculpture and strutted over to join her mother on the front line. She crossed her arms, a vicious, triumphant smirk plastered across her heavily contoured face. "You really have absolutely zero shame," Courtney sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You drag yourself in here looking like a depressed funeral director just to ruin my special day. But I guess you just cannot handle seeing what real success looks like. Bradley is a real man, a real visionary. He fully funded my entire luxury spa business completely out of his own pocket. He did not hesitate for a single second because he knows that blood is always thicker than water. He supports his real family, unlike some people who just aggressively drag him down. Bradley finally stepped forward, puffing out his chest and slipping his arm protectively around Courtney's shoulder. He looked at me with an absolutely nauseating mixture of fake pity and massive superiority. "Just give me the stupid paperwork, Megan," he demanded, holding his hand out expectantly. "You are completely wasting your time with all these financial disclosure requests. I have the most ruthless divorce lawyers in the entire city on retainer. I already told you to just take the $5,000 and disappear. You are severely embarrassing yourself in front of all these important people." I looked down at the heavy legal folder in my hand, and then I looked back up at Courtney's smug, arrogant face. In that exact fraction of a second, a sudden, profound realization hit me with the force of a freight train. When I reviewed Jamal's forensic accounting files in the shadow boardroom, I had seen a massive series of highly suspicious corporate transfers, legally categorized as independent wellness and health consultant retainers. Bradley had aggressively siphoned over $200,000 directly out of his tech company's primary operating budget under the strict guise of corporate wellness expenditures. The absolute delicious irony of the situation was almost too heavy to bear. Bradley did not use his own hard-earned money to fund Courtney's ridiculous spa. He did not have any hard-earned money. He had directly used my venture capital firm's stolen investment capital to pay for her leases, her massage tables, and that absurd ice sculpture melting right behind her. Courtney's entire arrogant identity as a successful small business owner was entirely funded by massive, undeniable corporate theft. My company legally owned her precious spa. I felt a genuine radiant smile slowly break across my face. It was not a defensive smile. It was the smile of a woman holding a royal flush, while everyone else at the table confidently bet their life savings on a pair of twos. I calmly handed the thick legal folder directly to Bradley. He snatched it from my hands with a dramatic scoff, completely oblivious to the absolute financial death sentence secretly waiting for him next Tuesday. "I truly hope your new wellness spa is wildly successful, Courtney," I said politely, my voice incredibly warm and completely devoid of any sarcasm. "You have absolutely no idea how deeply invested I am in your business operations. Enjoy the brunch. Enjoy the beautiful ice sculpture. Cherish every single moment of today." I did not wait for her confused response. I gracefully turned on my heel and walked straight out of the dining room, leaving them to eagerly celebrate their hollow, stolen victories. They were laughing and toasting to their incredible wealth, completely unaware that heavily armed federal agents and aggressive corporate auditors were currently preparing to seize every single asset they mistakenly believed they owned. The massive dominoes were perfectly lined up, and I was patiently holding the only match. I drove away from the manicured lawns of the country club with a cold sense of anticipation pulsing through my veins. The sound of Beatrice's mocking laughter still echoed faintly in my mind, but it no longer carried any sting. It was merely the desperate noise of an old regime completely unaware that its palace gates were already being torn down. I navigated my car through the heavy weekend traffic, heading directly back to the secure glass-fronted office building downtown, where Alexander and my primary corporate real estate legal team were waiting for me. They had been working around the clock, digging through the complex property portfolios associated with Bradley's tech startup. I parked in my reserved executive space, took the private elevator straight to the top floor, and walked into a smaller, highly confidential conference room where stacks of certified deeds and corporate registration documents covered the long glass table. Alexander looked up from his tablet, a razor-sharp smile playing on his lips. "Megan, you are going to absolutely love this," he said, pulling up a high-resolution property deed on the main wall monitor. "We just finished pulling the complete certified title history and the purchase financing records for the $900,000 luxury downtown condominium where Beatrice currently resides." Bradley was not just incredibly stupid to embezzle the funds, he was profoundly arrogant in how he structured the actual acquisition. He did not buy the property as an individual, and he did not take out a standard residential mortgage. Instead, he purchased the entire luxury condominium directly under his tech company's primary corporate umbrella. I sat down at the table, leaning forward to examine the digital documents displayed on the screen. "Explain the exact financial mechanism he used," I commanded flatly. Alexander tapped his screen, highlighting a series of fraudulent corporate expense reports. Bradley legally classified the entire $900,000 real estate purchase as a critical corporate asset acquisition. Alexander explained, shaking his head at the sheer audacity of the scheme. He officially listed the luxury condo in the corporate registry as an essential off-site executive retreat and guest housing facility for out-of-town investors and software consultants. By doing this, he completely avoided paying standard personal property taxes and aggressively wrote off the entire purchase price as a massive corporate business expense to artificially lower his company's reported net income. He thought he was a financial mastermind who had successfully cheated the system. He wanted to give his mother a lavish lifestyle without putting a single cent of his own personal money on the line, and he figured no one would ever bother to look closely at the guest housing ledger. A slow, dangerous wave of satisfaction washed completely over me as I stared at the legal corporate entity listed as the primary title holder on the deed. The official owner of Beatrice's luxury home was Bradley's tech startup, the exact same corporate entity that my venture capital firm held a 51% controlling stake in through our silent proxy holding company. The legal consequence of his unchecked arrogance was absolute and beautifully catastrophic. Because my venture capital firm legally owned the controlling majority of the tech company, and the tech company legally owned the condominium, my firm technically and absolutely owned the roof over Beatrice's head. The very woman who had aggressively thrown my clothes into the mud and ordered a demolition crew to smash my home office was currently sleeping, eating, and living inside a luxury property that belonged entirely to my corporate empire. She was not a wealthy Seattle socialite ruling over her domain. She was a clueless squatter living on my absolute charity. She had stood in that country club bragging about her family's superior bloodline and immense wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that her bed, her kitchen, and her beautiful view of the city were completely paid for by the investors I represented. "She truly believes she is completely untouchable," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet room. "She thinks she is the grand matriarch of a wealthy tech dynasty, and she is currently using my corporate assets to host lavish parties and look down on the rest of the world. Let us officially end that illusion right now." I turned directly to my lead corporate real estate attorney, who was waiting quietly at the end of the table with a pen in hand. "I want you to draft an immediate, legally ironclad 24-hour eviction notice for that specific downtown condominium address." I instructed, my tone carrying a ruthless finality. "Cite an immediate and flagrant unauthorized residential use of a primary corporate asset. Document the absolute fact that the property is strictly zoned and registered as a corporate guest facility, and that no unauthorized non-employees are legally permitted to occupy the premises as a permanent personal residence. Bradley has committed a severe fiduciary breach by allowing his mother to live there rent-free on the company dime, and we are enforcing our legal right to reclaim our property immediately." The real estate attorney nodded vigorously, already typing out the preliminary legal framework on his laptop. "We can have the emergency eviction order officially signed by a corporate officer and certified by the county court within the next few hours, Megan," he confirmed. "How do you want the delivery handled?" "Do not mail it and do not have it delivered by a standard courier," I ordered, my eyes narrowing with calculated precision. "I want a certified private process server to physically march up to the front doors of that luxury condominium complex. They are to hand-deliver the eviction notice directly into Beatrice's hands. Give her exactly 24 hours from the moment of service to completely vacate the premises, remove every single piece of her personal property, and return the keys directly to our corporate management office. If she refuses to leave or attempts to stall, authorize our private security team to immediately contact the county sheriff's department to have her forcibly removed for criminal trespassing on corporate property." And the timing, Alexander asked, knowing full well that everything in my grand strategy had to line up with absolute mathematical perfection. "Hold the physical service of the eviction notice until exactly next Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon," I commanded. "This notice will be deployed simultaneously with Bradley's corporate termination papers, the total freeze of his personal and professional bank accounts, and the immediate off-market cash sale of my suburban home. I want the entire fragile foundation of their toxic lives to violently collapse at the exact same second. While Beatrice is sitting in that courthouse hallway loudly mocking my poverty and celebrating my divorce, her precious luxury condo will be legally seized. While Bradley is trying to bully me into signing a miserable $5,000 settlement check his entire career, his company and his mother's home will vanish into thin air. I stood up from the conference table, smoothing down my black designer dress, feeling a profound sense of calm. The trap was now fully constructed, every single domino perfectly balanced and waiting for the final push. They believed they had successfully broken me, but next Tuesday they were going to learn a brutal, unforgettable lesson about what happens when you attempt to destroy the woman who secretly owns the entire board. That Sunday evening, the quiet solitude of my penthouse was interrupted by another encrypted call from Jamal. When I answered, the heavy sigh on the other end of the line spoke volumes before he even said a single word. He sounded utterly defeated, completely drained of the nervous energy that had driven him to expose Bradley just a few days prior. I asked him where he was. He told me he was sitting in his car in the driveway of his own home, physically unable to force himself to walk through the front door and face his wife. The extravagant country club brunch celebrating Courtney's wellness spa had predictably transitioned into an insufferable family dinner at Beatrice's luxury condo. Jamal had been forced to attend, sitting silently at the end of the table, while the three of them aggressively toasted to their own fabricated brilliance. He described the suffocating environment to me in painful detail. It was a masterclass in narcissistic family dynamics. Beatrice and Courtney had spent the entire evening relentlessly belittling Jamal's career. Courtney complained loudly to her mother that being married to a corporate auditor was incredibly embarrassing in her new elite social circles. She actually used the phrase boring pencil pusher to his face in front of the waitstaff. Jamal told me, his voice cracking slightly, with a mixture of anger and deep humiliation. According to Courtney, Jamal lacked ambition. He lacked the aggressive alpha male drive that made her brother Bradley such a supposed visionary genius. Beatrice had chimed in, swirling her expensive wine, reminding Jamal that he should be infinitely grateful that Courtney even settled for him, considering his meager, uninspiring salary. They spent 2 solid hours praising Bradley as the ultimate provider and the shining beacon of the family legacy, while treating the only truly honest man at the table like a disappointing, easily replaceable servant. I listened quietly, the anger simmering in my chest on his behalf. Jamal was a brilliant financial mind. His forensic accounting skills were sharper than men making 10 times his salary at my venture capital firm. Yet he was trapped in a toxic ecosystem designed to constantly crush his self-worth simply because he refused to lie, cheat, and steal to project a false image of wealth. But that is not even the worst part, Megan. Jamal continued, tapping his fingers nervously against his steering wheel. The grand opening today was a complete and total facade. Courtney's wellness spa is already a catastrophic financial failure. She spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on imported massage tables, crystal healing rooms, and ridiculous ice sculptures, but she has absolutely zero actual clients booked for the next 3 months. She has no marketing plan, no operational budget, and no concept of how to actually run a business. She just wanted the title of a luxury business owner so she could aggressively brag to her friends on social media. Jamal revealed that during the car ride home, Courtney had thrown a massive screaming tantrum because her business account was completely overdrawn. She had immediately called Bradley on speakerphone, aggressively demanding that he wire another $50,000 by Monday morning to cover her upcoming vendor payments and payroll. And Bradley, desperate to maintain his status as the benevolent, wealthy patriarch, had promised to make the transfer happen without a single moment of hesitation. "He is going to steal more money, Megan," Jamal whispered, the sheer panic returning to his voice. "I checked the live corporate ledgers right before I called you. Bradley is currently setting up another massive fraudulent vendor invoice to siphon the $50,000 directly out of the tech company's emergency payroll reserves. He is literally going to steal from his own employees' salaries just to fund Courtney's failing vanity project. If I do not report this to the authorities myself right now, I am technically complicit. I am a licensed auditor. I cannot just sit here and watch him commit federal wire fraud again. I needed to calm him down immediately. I could not risk Jamal accidentally triggering an early alarm that would tip Bradley off before Tuesday afternoon. I took a deep breath, projecting a warm, steadying confidence through the phone. Jamal listened to me very closely. I said, my voice firm and completely reassuring. You have already done your job. You secured the raw data. You handed over the undeniable proof. You are not complicit in his crimes because you are the exact whistleblower who bravely exposed them. You need to let Bradley process that $50,000 transfer tomorrow morning. Let him steal the money. Let him forge the new invoice. Every single desperate move he makes right now is just another heavy nail in his federal coffin. I heard him let out a shaky breath, clearly torn between his rigid professional ethics and his deep desire to see the family finally face true justice. He just wanted a stable, honest life for his young daughter, far away from the constant lying and aggressive manipulation. They called you a boring pencil pusher today. I continued, leaning forward and looking out at the glittering city lights. They aggressively mocked your integrity because toxic people always view honesty as a severe weakness. They genuinely think their stolen money makes them completely invincible. But they are completely wrong, Jamal. Your integrity is the most valuable asset you possess. It is the only currency that actually matters when the corporate auditors and the federal investigators finally come knocking on their doors. I paused, making absolutely sure he was absorbing every single word. You are a good man, Jamal. You are a dedicated father, and you are a brilliant financial mind. You have spent years letting these deeply broken, arrogant people convince you that you are somehow less than them. But I am telling you right now, your life is about to change in ways you cannot even begin to imagine. The storm is coming on Tuesday. When it hits, it is going to violently rip away their fake wealth, their unearned titles, and their cruel arrogance. But it is not going to touch you. You are going to walk out of this wreckage completely free. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. For the first time since I had met him, I could hear a genuine spark of hope cutting through his thick layer of depression. I told him to go inside, hug his young daughter, and simply ignore Courtney's toxic tantrums. I promised him that by Wednesday morning, Courtney would no longer have a luxury spa to complain about, and Beatrice would no longer have a high-end condo to host her miserable dinners in. I did not give him the exact details of my massive corporate trap, but I gave him the absolute certainty that justice was only 48 hours away. When we finally ended the call, I felt a deep, fierce determination settle over me. Destroying Bradley and Beatrice was a necessary act of corporate and personal hygiene, but liberating Jamal from that toxic nightmare and violently rewarding his unwavering honesty was going to be the absolute highlight of my entire week. I just needed to make sure the trap snapped shut with flawless, unavoidable precision. Monday morning arrived with a crisp clarity that perfectly mirrored my state of mind. I was sitting at the massive glass dining table in my penthouse, reviewing the final drafts of the corporate clawback lawsuits, when my phone shattered the quiet room. The caller ID displayed Bradley's name. For a brief second, I considered letting it go straight to voicemail, but I knew the psychological game required my active participation. I needed him to walk into that courthouse on Tuesday feeling like an absolute god among men. I tapped the green icon and answered the call, remaining perfectly silent so he would be forced to speak first. Well, I honestly thought you would be too humiliated to answer my call after that pathetic display at the country club yesterday. Bradley sneered, his voice thick with a nauseating level of unearned confidence. He sounded exactly like a man who had spent the entire weekend completely drunk on his own inflated ego, surrounded by sycophants who praised his every breath. What do you want, Bradley? I asked, keeping my tone carefully muted and flat, exactly how a defeated and broken woman would sound. I am calling to give you one final act of absolute mercy, he announced grandly, likely pacing around the hardwood floors of my suburban home. My legal team just finalized the exact terms of our divorce settlement for tomorrow afternoon. I am not going to drag this out in front of a judge for months. You are going to walk into that mediation room, sit down quietly, and sign exactly what is put in front of you. He began to list his demands with the aggressive rhythm of a ruthless corporate dictator. First, you are signing a massive ironclad non-disclosure agreement. You will never publicly speak about my relationship with Brittany, my personal finances, or my highly successful business operations. Second, you are officially waiving all rights to any form of spousal support or alimony. You do not get a single cent of my future earnings. Third, you will formally surrender any ridiculous claim you think you have to my house, my cars, and my corporate equity. In exchange for your immediate cooperation, I will hand you a certified check for $5,000 so you can put a deposit down on whatever miserable little studio apartment you manage to find. I let out a slow, calculated breath, making sure the phone microphone caught the exact sound of my supposed despair. Bradley, that is not a fair settlement, I whispered deliberately, injecting a slight desperate tremor into my voice. I supported you for 5 long years. I helped you build your company when you had absolutely nothing. $5,000 is barely enough to survive on for 2 months. My feigned weakness was like fresh blood in the water for a shark. He laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed loudly through the phone speaker. You did not build anything, Megan. He barked, his arrogance reaching its absolute peak. I built this massive empire. I am the visionary. You just sat quietly in the passenger seat while I drove us to extreme wealth. Let me make this incredibly clear to you, so your tiny, low-level financial brain can actually comprehend it. If you try to fight me on this, if you refuse to sign that paperwork tomorrow, I will legally destroy you. I have the most expensive, ruthless attorneys in the state on speed dial. I will drag this divorce out for years. I will bury you in so many legal fees that you will be forced to declare permanent bankruptcy. I am a tech titan, Megan. You are a nobody. You have zero leverage, zero money, and zero power. I closed my eyes, a massive, predatory smile spreading across my face. He was playing his part so perfectly it almost felt heavily scripted. He was willingly handing me the exact narrative I needed to make his impending destruction completely flawless and utterly devastating. Okay, I said, allowing my voice to break realistically on the final syllable. I let a long, heavy silence hang in the digital space between us before I delivered the ultimate bait. You win, Bradley. I just want this entire nightmare to be over. I am so tired of fighting you and your toxic family. Just bring the documents to the courthouse tomorrow. I will not argue. I will not bring my own lawyer. I will just sign whatever your legal team puts in front of me so I can finally move on with my miserable life. The sheer, unadulterated triumph in his heavy sigh was almost intoxicating to listen to. That is the smartest decision you have made in 5 years, Megan, he praised mockingly, fully believing he had just successfully bullied me into complete submission. Make sure you wear something highly presentable tomorrow. I do not want you embarrassing me in front of the judge. He abruptly ended the call, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet luxury of my penthouse. I gently placed the phone down on the glass table and laughed out loud. It was not a bitter laugh, but a laugh of pure, crystalline victory. He genuinely thought he had completely outsmarted me. He honestly believed his aggressive threats had forced me to surrender. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time, the caller ID displayed the name of my elite commercial real estate broker. I answered immediately, my voice instantly returning to its natural, commanding tone. Tell me you have good news, I demanded. The absolute best news, Megan, my broker replied smoothly. I just received the official confirmation from the county clerk and the private escrow agency. The commercial developer successfully wired the entire $1.5 million in pure cash directly into your blind corporate holding account 10 minutes ago. The funds have completely cleared our security checks and the required paperwork. I asked, my heart beating with the steady rhythm of a perfectly executed hostile takeover. The title transfer is officially complete and permanently recorded in the county registry, he confirmed happily. You legally no longer own that suburban property. The commercial development firm is now the sole undisputed legal owner of the house and the surrounding land. They have already scheduled their private demolition crew to arrive on site tomorrow afternoon. I thanked my broker, hung up the phone, and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city. A profound, terrifying sense of absolute control washed over every single nerve in my body. The trap had officially snapped shut. The heavy steel doors were firmly locked in place, and Bradley had gleefully thrown away the only key. Right at this very second, Bradley was likely strutting proudly around that large suburban living room, bragging aggressively to his pregnant mistress about how he had just successfully crushed his ex-wife. He was probably pacing the halls, planning out the exact color scheme for his brand-new nursery, feeling like the absolute undisputed king of his heavily mortgaged castle. He was completely blissfully unaware of the catastrophic reality of his actual situation. He was currently standing on hardwood floors he did not own. He was going to spend the night sleeping comfortably in a massive luxury bed inside a house where he had absolutely zero legal right to be. He was nothing more than an arrogant trespasser marking time until the heavy machinery arrived to tear his entire fabricated kingdom down to the concrete foundation. And he was going to find out the absolute truth at the exact same moment he thought he had finally conquered the entire world. The final 24 hours before a total corporate and personal annihilation operate on a highly specific frequency. It is Monday evening, the shadows stretching long and dark across the polished hardwood floors of my downtown command center. I sit alone at my massive glass desk, the glow of multiple monitors painting my face in sharp angles of blue and white light. The chaotic, emotional mess of a standard divorce is entirely behind me. I am no longer a betrayed spouse desperately trying to salvage a toxic relationship. I am a highly skilled executive orchestrating a flawless multi-million-dollar hostile takeover. The narrative of my life has rapidly shifted from a tragic domestic drama into a high-stakes, precision-timed heist, and every single moving part is currently locking into its final, unavoidable position. I glance at the primary monitor on my left. A secure digital vault displays the finalized commercial real estate dossier. Element number 1 is fully complete. The title transfer for the sprawling suburban property is officially stamped, verified, and heavily encrypted in the county registry. The massive commercial development firm has already filed their expedited demolition permits. I review the attached schedule. A fleet of heavy industrial bulldozers and massive dump trucks is currently parked in a secured holding lot exactly 3 miles away from Bradley's front door. The foreman has his strict, unyielding orders. They will roll onto the property at exactly 3:00 tomorrow afternoon. Bradley is currently eating his dinner on a luxury kitchen island that is legally scheduled to be violently crushed into dust in less than 20 hours. I shift my gaze to the physical space on my desk. Resting perfectly in the center of the glass is a thick, heavy manila envelope. Element number 2 is locked and loaded. Inside that sealed package rests the ironclad court ordered 24-hour eviction notice for Beatrice's luxury downtown condominium. I run my fingers over the smooth paper, feeling the deeply satisfying weight of impending justice. My lead real estate attorney hired the most aggressive, relentless private process server in the entire Pacific Northwest. He is a massive, incredibly intimidating former law enforcement officer who absolutely does not take no for an answer. He has already been given Beatrice's exact daily schedule. He will confidently bypass the building concierge ride, the private elevator, and physically force that legal envelope directly into her perfectly manicured hands. By tomorrow night, she will be furiously packing her expensive designer clothes into cheap garbage bags under the direct, unblinking supervision of armed private security. My encrypted phone lights up with an incoming high-priority message. I tap the screen to open a secure chat portal. It is Alexander, my primary corporate attorney, checking in from his secure office downtown. Element number 3 is officially armed. Alexander confirms that the shadow board of directors for the tech company has already pre-signed the emergency executive termination documents. More importantly, he has spent the last 3 hours coordinating directly with the senior compliance officers at Bradley's primary banking institution. The massive asset freeze is not just a theoretical legal threat, it is a highly sophisticated digital kill switch pre-programmed into the bank's central servers. At exactly 3 o'clock tomorrow, a synchronized algorithmic command will automatically execute. Bradley's corporate credit cards will instantly decline. His personal checking accounts will plummet to absolute zero. His executive login credentials will permanently lock him out of his own company network. He will be instantly, profoundly, and permanently financially paralyzed. I send a simple confirmation acknowledgement back to Alexander and close the chat window. A second later, my private encrypted email server pings with a new, highly restricted incoming message. The sender address is masked, but the specific encryption key tells me exactly who it is from. Element number 4 is now fully operational. It is a brief, heavily sanitized confirmation from my primary contact within the Federal White-Collar Crime Division. The FBI has officially received and fully authenticated the massive digital dossier of wire fraud evidence I forwarded to them through a secure intermediary. Jamal's meticulous forensic accounting files have provided the federal agents with a perfect, undeniable roadmap of Bradley's continuous corporate embezzlement. The federal prosecutors have enough concrete evidence to completely bypass a grand jury. They are currently fast-tracking federal arrest warrants for aggressive corporate wire fraud and illegal misappropriation of company funds. I lean back in my ergonomic leather chair, letting the sheer magnitude of the incoming destruction completely wash over me. Everything is perfectly aligned. There are absolutely no loose ends. There are no remaining variables that Bradley or his toxic family can possibly manipulate. They have spent the last 6 months aggressively pushing me toward a cliff, completely unaware that I used that entire time to quietly build a parachute and meticulously plant highly explosive charges all over their bridge. I stand up and walk slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The vibrant, glittering skyline of Seattle stretches out before me in a vast ocean of electric light. The city is completely alive, pulsing with millions of people going about their ordinary lives, totally oblivious to the absolute perfection of the storm I have secretly engineered. I press my hand flat against the cool glass. I search my heart for any lingering trace of guilt. I look for any small flicker of sadness over the violent death of my marriage. I check to see if my hands are shaking or my breathing is shallow. Nothing. There are absolutely no tears. There is no hesitation. There is not a single ounce of fear, regret, or misplaced nostalgia. The soft, forgiving woman who desperately tried to save a broken marriage no longer exists. She was systematically suffocated by Bradley's relentless arrogance and Beatrice's cruel, calculated emotional abuse. In her place stands a woman forged entirely in the freezing fires of betrayal. I am a machine fueled by pure cold logic and an unyielding demand for absolute justice. I look out over the glowing city and smile, feeling the quiet mechanical precision of a surgeon preparing to completely dismantle a toxic disease. Tomorrow, Bradley will walk into that courthouse expecting to conquer a helpless victim. Instead, he's going to step directly into a corporate slaughterhouse. I turn away from the window, switch off the desk lamp, and walk into the darkness of my bedroom to get a perfect night of sleep. Tuesday afternoon arrived with the absolute precision of a scheduled execution. At exactly 2 o'clock, my private driver pulled the sleek black town car smoothly up to the grand stone steps of the county courthouse. The massive granite pillars loomed high overhead, a sterile, imposing monument to legal finality. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, casually adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal designer suit. The fabric was a flawless, ultra-premium blend of Italian silk and lightweight wool custom cut to project absolute corporate authority. For 5 long years, I had deliberately downplayed my appearance, wearing simple, unbranded clothing and minimal makeup to keep Bradley from feeling threatened by my true financial status. They had spent our entire marriage treating me like a plain, uninspired girl from the suburbs who was lucky to even breathe the same air as their family. Today, that carefully constructed illusion was permanently dead. My hair was swept back into a flawless, razor-sharp chignon, my makeup was striking and minimal, and my designer high heels struck the granite steps with the steady, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned general marching straight to the front line. I passed through the heavy security checkpoints inside the main entrance, the metal detectors echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged marble lobby. The courthouse was packed with people rushing between hearings, but I moved through the throngs with a singular, unbroken focus. My elite legal team was already quietly positioned inside the private consultation rooms down the hall, waiting patiently for my final operational signal. I carried absolutely no heavy accordion files, no frantic legal notes, and no visible signs of anxiety. I carried only a small, elegant designer clutch and the absolute certainty that the entire universe was about to violently realign in my favor. I took the grand escalator up to the third floor, where the family law mediation suites and private courtrooms were located. The air up here felt thinner heavy, with the suffocating scent of corporate desperation and broken domestic promises. As I stepped off the escalator and turned down the long, polished hallway toward Mediation Room 3B, I spotted them immediately. The toxic trio had arrived in full force, and they had clearly decided to treat the sterile courthouse corridor like a high-fashion red carpet premiere for their own unearned success. Bradley was leading the pack, strutting down the center of the hallway, with his chest aggressively puffed out like a conquering king. He was wearing an incredibly flashy custom bespoke navy suit with bright brass buttons, a pristine white silk pocket square, and highly polished Italian leather shoes that practically mirrored the floor. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had already won the absolute lottery, completely oblivious to the fact that his ticket was about to be permanently incinerated. Right beside him was Brittany, leaning heavily into his side with a smug, possessive grip. She was dripping in an obscene, blinding amount of dazzling designer jewelry. A massive multi-carat diamond necklace caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway, flanked by matching diamond tennis bracelets that jingled loudly with every single step she took. It was a grotesque, classless display of wealth, made infinitely more repulsive by the absolute fact that every single stone had been purchased using the corporate funds Bradley had aggressively embezzled from my venture capital firm. And right behind them, acting as the ultimate vanguard of their arrogant parade, was Beatrice. She was dressed in an expensive, structured emerald green couture dress, her posture rigidly upright, her eyes scanning the hallway like a medieval queen preparing to watch a public execution. Courtney followed closely behind her mother, whispering eagerly into Beatrice's ear, a triumphant, vicious smirk permanently etched onto her face. They looked exactly like a royal family, arriving to execute a helpless peasant. To any casual observer standing in the hallway, they were the absolute picture of modern American wealth, power, and influence, while I stood alone near the water fountain, a solitary figure in a dark suit. Bradley spotted me first. His eyes locked onto my tailored designer suit, a brief, faint flicker of deep confusion crossing his face, before his mask of pure arrogance locked firmly back into place. He patted Brittany's hand reassuringly and walked directly toward my position, Beatrice and Courtney flanking him like personal bodyguards. "I see you actually took my advice and wore something presentable for once," Bradley said loudly, his voice echoing off the marble walls so the surrounding lawyers could hear him. He checked his heavy gold watch, flashing it aggressively in my direction. "My legal team is already inside finalizing the final settlement paperwork, Megan. I highly hope you brought a working pen. Remember exactly what we discussed on the phone yesterday. You sign the waiver, you sign the NDA. You take your $5,000, and we can all walk out of here with our dignity intact. Do not try to make a pathetic scene in front of the mediator. It will not end well for you." I did not answer him. I did not offer a single defensive remark, and I did not let my expression change. I simply stood there, my posture completely relaxed, my expression entirely unreadable. My absolute silence seemed to infuriate Beatrice. She aggressively stepped around her son, closing the distance between us until she was standing less than 2 feet away. The heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive perfume filled the air. She tilted her head down, glaring at me through narrowed, venomous eyes, looking at me as if I were a pathetic insect that had dared to ruin her family's pristine carpet. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a sharp, venomous hiss that vibrated with pure malice. "Try not to cry too loudly when you leave that room with absolutely nothing, Megan," she whispered, her teeth practically gritting together with pure hatred. "You thought you could actually threaten my son. You thought you belonged in our world. But after today, you are going right back to the gutter where you belong. We are going to strip you of everything you ever thought you had." I looked directly into Beatrice's hateful, wrinkled face. I did not flinch. I did not let my jaw clench, and I did not offer a single word of defense. Instead, I slowly and deliberately raised my left wrist. I looked down at the face of my stunning custom diamond executive watch. The sweeping second hand was moving with cold, mechanical finality, ticking away the last remaining moments of their entirely fabricated empire. The digital clock on the courthouse wall read exactly 2:45 p.m. There were exactly 15 minutes left. 15 minutes until the shadow board executed the corporate termination papers. 15 minutes until the bank compliance algorithms activated the total asset freeze. 15 minutes until the commercial bulldozers rolled onto my suburban lawn and the private process server marched into Beatrice's luxury condo building. The countdown to their absolute catastrophic destruction was officially operational. I looked back up from my watch, a quiet, terrifyingly calm smile playing on the corners of my lips. "It is almost 3 o'clock, Beatrice," I said softly, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of fear. "Let us go inside. I would hate to keep Destiny waiting." We pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and entered the sterile, severely intimidating mediation courtroom. The space was designed to make you feel incredibly small, featuring high vaulted ceilings and a massive polished mahogany table positioned directly in front of the judge's elevated bench. The Honorable Judge Harrison, a stern-looking man with zero tolerance for emotional outbursts or courtroom theatrics, was already seated and silently reviewing the preliminary case files. Bradley immediately took the dominant high-backed leather chair on the left side of the room, flanked by his incredibly aggressive, highly expensive lead attorney. Brittany seated herself directly behind him in the public gallery, boldly holding Beatrice's hand. Courtney sat right beside them, her arms crossed defensively. They formed a unified, impenetrable wall of extreme arrogance, genuinely believing they were about to witness my absolute financial execution. I walked to the right side of the room and sat down next to my own legal counsel. I had purposely instructed Alexander, my primary corporate shark, to stay safely hidden back at our downtown headquarters. Instead, I brought Elias, a brilliant but incredibly unassuming junior partner from my corporate litigation team. Today, Elias was playing the very specific, highly orchestrated role of a low-tier, completely overwhelmed family lawyer. He wore a slightly rumpled gray suit, carried a massive stack of disorganized yellow legal pads, and physically shrank away from the aggressive glare of Bradley's high-powered legal team. He deserved a literal Academy Award for the performance he was about to give. Judge Harrison banged his wooden gavel once to formally call the room to order. He instructed Bradley's attorney to present the proposed settlement agreement for the official court record. The man stood up aggressively, buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, and began reading the terms with a deeply theatrical, booming voice, specifically designed to completely humiliate me in public. "Your Honor, my client is offering an incredibly generous expedited settlement to spare this court months of completely unnecessary litigation," the attorney announced, sneering down his nose at Elias. "The terms are strictly non-negotiable and entirely straightforward. My client Bradley will retain 100% absolute ownership of the primary marital residence located in the suburbs, including all equity, physical assets, and property rights. He will also retain complete uncontested ownership of his highly successful technology startup, including all corporate assets, operational accounts, and future intellectual property." The lawyer paused deliberately, letting the heavy weight of those massive financial assets hang in the silent room. Furthermore, he continued, his tone dripping with profound condescension. "Bradley will retain sole possession of all personal savings investment portfolios and offshore holding accounts currently registered under his name, in exchange for signing a strict, comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, preventing her from ever speaking publicly about his business or personal affairs. The respondent Megan will be graciously permitted to keep her 2010 four-door sedan. She will also receive a one-time courtesy payout of exactly $5,000 to assist with her immediate relocation expenses. She officially waives any and all rights to any current or future spousal support. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the legal document was magnificent. It was not a fair settlement. It was a complete unconditional surrender designed to leave a woman entirely destitute, legally gagged, and completely broken. Bradley leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, with an incredibly smug, victorious grin plastered permanently across his face. He looked directly over at me, fully expecting to see tears streaming down my cheeks. He expected me to be hyperventilating, openly sobbing, and begging the judge for a tiny shred of mercy. Instead, I simply looked down at my hands. Elias immediately sprang into action, playing his role with absolutely flawless precision. He leaned close to my ear, visibly sweating, and began aggressively whispering, exactly loud enough for Bradley's team to easily overhear. "Megan, you have to sign this right now," Elias urged intentionally, making his voice shake with fabricated anxiety and pure panic. "They have entirely too much firepower. If you try to fight this in open court, they will mercilessly drag this out for 5 years. They will absolutely bury us in endless discovery motions. You will end up owing hundreds of thousands in legal fees you cannot possibly afford. Please just take the $5,000 and walk away before he completely destroys your life." I let my shoulders dramatically slump forward. I took a deep, shaky breath, projecting the absolute perfect image of a woman whose entire spirit had just been violently snapped in half. I looked up at the judge with wide, completely defeated eyes. Judge Harrison looked down at me from his elevated bench, his stern expression softening into a look of genuine, uncomfortable pity. "Ma'am, do you fully understand the strict terms of this binding agreement?" he asked quietly. "You are permanently signing away any and all legal rights to your ex-husband's property, his corporate assets, and his personal savings. Once I strike this gavel, this financial decision is completely irreversible." "I understand, Your Honor," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly small, frail, and entirely defeated. Bradley's lawyer aggressively pushed the thick stack of settlement papers across the polished mahogany table, placing a heavy, expensive gold fountain pen directly on top of the primary signature line. "Sign every single page where the red flags are prominently marked," he demanded coldly. I slowly picked up the heavy gold pen. I looked down at the bold legal text. The specific wording was absolutely magnificent. I was legally and permanently waiving all rights to Bradley's primary residence. I was permanently waiving all rights to Bradley's corporate assets. I was permanently waiving all rights to Bradley's personal savings. The beautiful, undeniable irony of the ironclad contract was that Bradley did not actually own a single one of those things. I was officially signing away my legal rights to a massive pile of absolute nothing. By specifically defining the assets as legally belonging to him, the contract was entirely nullified by the catastrophic reality occurring just outside these courtroom walls. I already legally owned his tech company through my silent proxy firm. The massive commercial developer already legally owned the suburban house. The bank was currently seizing his non-existent savings to cover his massive corporate fraud. I was not surrendering my multi-billion-dollar empire. I was simply tying a neat legal bow around his empty, rapidly sinking ship. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the thick paper. I signed my name with a smooth, decisive flourish. I flipped to the next page and signed again. Page after heavy page, I methodically surrendered every single phantom asset he arrogantly thought he controlled. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a massive surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooding my veins. When I finally reached the last page, I signed my name one final time and slowly pushed the document back across the table. Bradley snatched the paperwork eagerly. He hastily flipped through the pages, his eyes hungrily verifying my signature on every single line. When he was completely satisfied, he looked up at me, his smile so wide and vicious it looked like a feral animal preparing to feast. He genuinely believed he had just successfully executed the greatest financial victory of his entire life. He believed he was completely untouchable. Judge Harrison reviewed the final signature page, sighed heavily, and picked up his wooden gavel. By the power vested in me by the state, I formally accept this settlement agreement, he announced, his voice echoing loudly through the silent courtroom. The marriage is hereby legally dissolved. The financial terms are permanently locked into the court record. The heavy wooden gavel came down with a loud, sharp crack. It was done. The divorce was officially finalized. I was legally free. I casually raised my left wrist and looked down at the diamond face of my designer watch. The sweeping second hand smoothly crossed the 12. The digital display clicked perfectly into place. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The exact second the judge's gavel struck the sounding block, the massive invisible machinery of my revenge violently engaged. In a highly secure server room across town, the bank's automated compliance system instantly locked every single financial account connected to Bradley's name. 3 miles away, a massive yellow bulldozer aggressively crashed through the front gates of the suburban property, and in the lobby of a luxury downtown high-rise, an armed private process server aggressively stepped onto Beatrice's private elevator. Bradley forcefully stood up from the table aggressively, buttoning his bespoke jacket, looking down at me. Like I was a piece of trash, he had just successfully swept out the door. "We are done here, Megan," he sneered, turning his back on me to celebrate with his toxic family. I remained completely seated, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile finally breaking completely across my face. We were absolutely not done. In fact, the true unimaginable horrors of his day had literally just begun. I stood up slowly from the mahogany table, deliberately smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from my charcoal designer suit. Elias playing his assigned role of the entirely defeated junior lawyer, right to the absolute bitter end, gave me a barely perceptible nod, before hastily packing his disorganized yellow legal pads into his battered briefcase and scurrying out a side door. I was left entirely alone in the massive courtroom. I picked up my elegant designer clutch, took one final look at the sterile space where my fake marriage had just been legally incinerated, and turned toward the heavy wooden double doors. The air in the room felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating weight of playing the obedient, clueless wife for 5 agonizing years had officially been lifted from my shoulders. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the expansive marble hallway of the courthouse. The harsh fluorescent lighting reflected brightly off the polished floors. I fully expected Bradley and his toxic entourage to be halfway down the block by now, rushing off to celebrate their massive, fabricated victory with expensive champagne. But they had not left. They were waiting specifically for me. They had intentionally formed a human barricade directly across the center of the hallway, completely blocking my path to the grand escalator. They wanted to bask in the absolute glory of my destruction. They wanted to see the tears they assumed I had been desperately holding back inside the courtroom. Bradley stood in the very center, clutching the signed settlement folder against his bespoke suit jacket, like a freshly won athletic trophy. Brittany was aggressively hanging onto his left arm, her absurd diamond tennis bracelet sparkling under the artificial lights, wearing a sickeningly sweet smile of pure triumph. Courtney was standing off to the right, aggressively chewing a piece of gum and looking at me with undisguised disgust. But it was Beatrice who immediately took the lead. As I walked slowly toward them, my designer heels clicking with absolute authority against the marble floor, Beatrice forcefully stepped directly into my path. She was flanked tightly by Bradley and Brittany, forming an impenetrable wall of supreme arrogance. Beatrice looked me up and down, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of the moment, desperate to deliver the final killing blow to my self-esteem. She leaned aggressively forward, invading my personal space just like she had done at the country club, but this time there was no audience to impress. This was purely for her own cruel satisfaction. "Do not ever set foot in my house again!" Beatrice spat, her voice laced with absolute venom, completely disregarding the fact that we were standing in a public federal building. "You are entirely stripped of everything. You are a nobody. Get out and stay out." The hallway went completely silent. The few remaining lawyers and clerks in the corridor stopped talking and turned to watch the aggressive confrontation. Bradley let out a low, cruel chuckle, clearly thoroughly enjoying his mother, aggressively bullying the woman he had just legally discarded. Courtney smirked and crossed her arms tighter. I stopped walking. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my gaze. I stood perfectly still, a massive, terrifying sense of power flooding directly into my veins. The carefully constructed mask of the weak, defeated suburban housewife instantly shattered into a million invisible pieces. My posture completely straightened, my shoulders pulled back, and the full, undeniable aura of a ruthless corporate managing partner radiated outward. I looked directly into Beatrice's vicious, wrinkled eyes, and then I slowly shifted my gaze to Bradley. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread completely across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a woman who was currently holding a lit match while standing in a room entirely soaked in gasoline. Actually, I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing loudly in the sudden quiet of the marble hallway. I already sold that house. The new owners are arriving with a demolition crew at 5 p.m. today. The absolute silence that followed those words was thick and incredibly heavy. For exactly 3 seconds, their brains aggressively refused to process the information. Beatrice blinked rapidly, her face twisting in pure confusion. Brittany tilted her head like a confused dog. Bradley simply stared at me, his arrogant smirk frozen completely in place, desperately trying to compute a mathematical equation that made zero logical sense to his massive ego. "What the hell are you even talking about?" Bradley finally scoffed, breaking the silence with a loud, aggressive bark of laughter. He forcefully tapped the thick legal folder he was clutching against his chest. "Did you completely lose your mind in there? I just watched you legally sign over all of your rights to my property. The judge legally finalized it 3 minutes ago. I own the house, Megan. You own absolutely nothing." "You honestly believe you own that house because your name is on a piece of paper," I replied, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous register. "Let me give you a complimentary lesson in advanced corporate asset management, Bradley. You never actually owned that property. You transferred the primary deed to a private limited liability corporation 3 years ago to artificially shield your personal assets from corporate taxes. You thought you were an absolute financial genius, but you were incredibly lazy." Bradley's laughter instantly died in his throat. The smug confidence began to violently drain from his face, replaced by a sudden sickening wave of pure apprehension. "You aggressively instructed your lawyers to establish that holding company?" I continued, taking one slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Beatrice to actually take a nervous step backward. "But you never bothered to read the secondary ownership documents. That holding company is legally managed and controlled by a parent venture capital firm. A firm that I legally own a 51% controlling stake in. Therefore, Bradley, my firm owns the holding company owns the property, and I own the absolute right to liquidate that asset at my own discretion." I watched the exact moment the catastrophic reality finally breached the thick walls of his arrogance. His jaw went completely slack. His eyes darted frantically around the hallway as if looking for a hidden camera. "I legally sold the entire property to a massive commercial development firm at exactly 8 o'clock yesterday morning," I explained, driving the final nail flawlessly into his coffin. "The transaction was paid entirely in cash. The county clerk officially finalized the title transfer 3 hours ago. The papers you just aggressively forced me to sign in that courtroom are legally worthless. You made me surrender a house you do not legally own. Right now, a massive industrial bulldozer is idling at the end of the street. At exactly 5 p.m. today, they are going to drive that machine directly through the front living room window and crush your entire fake kingdom into gravel." Beatrice gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in absolute horror. Brittany let go of Bradley's arm, instinctively taking a large step away from him, as if his sudden poverty was highly contagious. "You are completely lying," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking, a desperate hollow sound echoing in the hallway. "You cannot possibly do this. That is my home. All of my expensive things are inside that house." I smiled again, checking my custom diamond watch one final time. "It is not your home, Bradley. It is an active demolition site, and if I were you, I would hurry. You have exactly 2 hours to rescue your tailored suits before they are permanently buried under 3 tons of concrete." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the marble hallway was the distant hum of the courthouse ventilation system. Then Bradley threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming, entirely forced sound that echoed harshly against the stone walls. He looked around at his mother and his mistress, practically begging them to join in his amusement. "You are completely delusional, Megan," he chuckled, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "You honestly expect me to believe this ridiculous fantasy? You can't sell my house. I am the primary resident. I have been paying the massive mortgage and the property taxes on that estate for the last 3 years. You are literally just making things up because you are incredibly bitter that I'm walking away with everything." I did not break eye contact. I let his desperate, hollow laughter completely die out before I delivered the absolute reality check. "It was never your house, Bradley," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, undeniable authority. "It was owned entirely by my limited liability corporation. You never paid a single actual mortgage payment. You just paid the light bills and covered the landscaping costs to maintain the illusion of ownership. When you signed those complex transfer documents 3 years ago, you were so incredibly arrogant and eager to hide your personal assets from potential corporate tax liabilities that you completely failed to read the parent company details. You willingly handed the primary deed over to a holding firm that I fully control. You essentially became a high-paying tenant in a property that I legally owned. And as the ultimate legal owner, I chose to liquidate the asset today for a massive cash profit." The blood instantly drained from Bradley's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw hung slightly open as his brain aggressively fought to reject the terrifying reality I had just presented. Beatrice stepped forward, her expensive emerald green dress rustling aggressively against the marble floor. "She is completely bluffing, Bradley," Beatrice hissed, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is just a desperate, pathetic woman trying to ruin your special day. Call your real estate attorney right now and prove her wrong." Bradley fumbled in the inside pocket of his bespoke suit jacket, his hands suddenly shaking so violently he could barely grip his expensive smartphone. Before he could even unlock the screen, I calmly reached into my elegant designer clutch. I did not pull out a standard legal document. I pulled out a thick, heavy piece of premium boardroom cardstock bearing the official embossed logo of his technology startup. "I am absolutely not bluffing, Beatrice," I said, completely ignoring her trembling finger. "But the suburban house is merely a minor real estate transaction. We have much larger, significantly more devastating corporate business to discuss right now." I turned my full attention back to Bradley, who was staring at the familiar corporate logo on the folded document in my hand with wide, panicked eyes. "And by the way, Bradley," I added smoothly, raising my voice just enough to ensure the entire hallway heard my next sentence, "I just formally fired you as Chief Executive Officer of your company." I extended my arm and pressed the heavy corporate termination notice directly against his chest. He took it mechanically, his fingers gripping the thick paper as if it were a venomous snake. "Read the official letterhead, Bradley," I commanded, my tone shifting into the undeniable voice of a ruthless corporate dictator. "Exactly 4 years ago, your pathetic little startup was completely bleeding cash. You were burning through capital at an alarming rate, your primary investors were actively fleeing, and you were exactly 2 weeks away from declaring total corporate bankruptcy. Then, a mysterious angel investment firm magically swooped in and purchased a 51% controlling stake. You celebrated for an entire week. You aggressively patted yourself on the back and called yourself an absolute visionary genius for securing that massive funding round. Bradley's eyes darted frantically across the text of the termination notice. I watched his chest begin to heave as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. That angel investment firm is a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of my primary venture capital group, I explained, driving the corporate blade incredibly deep. I personally authorized that specific acquisition. I am the managing partner of that firm. I am the silent majority shareholder of your entire technological empire. I own the board of directors. I own your proprietary software, which officially means, Bradley, that I am your boss. Brittany let out a sharp, highly audible gasp. She instinctively reached up and tightly gripped the massive diamond necklace resting against her chest, her eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror. Courtney took a massive step backward, physically distancing herself from her brother, as the financial reality of his situation violently crashed down around them. You are officially terminated for severe, aggressively documented fiduciary breach, I announced, watching Bradley's arrogant posture completely disintegrate. The official executive order went into effect exactly 5 minutes ago. My lead forensic auditor, Jamal, has spent the last 3 weeks meticulously compiling an ironclad digital dossier of your massive corporate embezzlement. We know absolutely everything. We know you stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the emergency payroll reserves to fund Courtney's entirely fake wellness spa. We know you aggressively siphoned off operating budgets to purchase those ridiculous designer diamonds currently wrapped around your pregnant mistress. You treated my company's sacred operating budget like your own personal unregulated piggy bank. No, Bradley wheezed, his voice sounding incredibly small and entirely broken. You cannot do this to me. I built that company. I am the founder. You were the founder, I corrected him sharply. Now you are just an unemployed liability facing massive federal wire fraud charges. You have absolutely zero remaining equity. Your executive contract has been permanently voided without any severance package. Your corporate security access was permanently revoked 3 minutes ago. You do not even have a valid key card to get into the building to pack up your expensive office decor. The Shadow Board of Directors voted unanimously to remove you, and I personally signed the final termination documents. Bradley stumbled backward, physically crashing into the marble wall of the corridor for support. The bespoke navy suit that had looked so incredibly powerful 10 minutes ago now looked like a ridiculous, oversized costume on a broken, terrified man. He looked at the termination notice, then at me, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of his absolute defeat. He had walked into this courthouse fully expecting to legally execute a helpless peasant. Instead, he had blindly walked directly into a massive corporate guillotine, and I had just gracefully pulled the lever. Bradley stood completely paralyzed against the cold marble wall, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his sudden ruin. Deep inside his bespoke suit jacket, his expensive smartphone suddenly began to vibrate with violent, continuous urgency. He frantically pulled it out, his shaking thumbs struggling to unlock the screen. The synchronized digital avalanche I had meticulously orchestrated had officially hit its peak. A massive cascade of red notification banners aggressively flooded his display. His primary corporate email account was permanently locked. His executive cloud server access was instantly revoked. Then came the catastrophic banking alerts. His primary checking account displayed a massive zero balance. His personal savings were completely frozen, pending a massive federal fraud investigation. His elite corporate platinum cards were instantly canceled by the automated compliance algorithms. He was profoundly and permanently financially paralyzed. Brittany, entirely oblivious to the absolute financial apocalypse occurring right next to her, huffed in deep annoyance at the tense, silent atmosphere. She pulled out her own phone, her heavy diamond bracelets aggressively clinking together. She loudly announced she was going to order a luxury Uber Black to take them all to their expensive victory dinner. A few seconds later, a bright red error message flashed aggressively across her screen. She forcefully tapped the retry button. Denied. She aggressively opened her digital wallet and tried a different platinum card. Declined. Every single credit card in her possession, all of which were secretly linked directly to Bradley's stolen corporate accounts, was completely dead. "What the hell is wrong with your stupid bank accounts, Bradley?" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly down the quiet courthouse corridor. "The app is saying insufficient funds. Fix it right now. I am not standing in this miserable public hallway for another second." Bradley could not even answer her. He simply stared blankly at his dark screen, the devastating reality of his total financial destruction completely shattering his massive ego. He had absolutely nothing left. No company, no house, no money. I slowly turned away from the pathetic scene of the ruined visionary and his screaming mistress. I focused my entire attention directly on Beatrice. The haughty, arrogant matriarch, who had spent the last 5 years relentlessly mocking my clothes and my background, was currently completely silent. Her face was ashen, her hands violently trembling by her sides. I casually reached into my designer clutch one final time and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope. I extended my arm and firmly pressed the sealed document directly against her chest until her shaking fingers instinctively grasped it. "That is a legally certified court-ordered 24-hour eviction notice for your beautiful downtown luxury condominium," I said softly, my voice dripping with absolute freezing finality. "That property is officially registered as a corporate asset. It belongs entirely to my venture capital firm, which means you are currently criminally trespassing on my private property. You have exactly until tomorrow afternoon to pack your expensive emerald dresses into cheap garbage bags and completely vacate the premises. Have a wonderful life, Beatrice." I did not wait for her inevitable shattered response. I gracefully turned on my heel and walked purposefully toward the grand escalator. Behind me, the marble hallway violently erupted into a chaotic, panicking chorus of absolute despair. Beatrice began to wail hysterically, a loud, ugly sound of pure defeat. Brittany aggressively screamed at Bradley about her dead credit cards and her frozen bank accounts. Bradley practically hyperventilated against the stone wall. I stepped onto the descending escalator, perfectly bathed in the warm overhead lights, and rode smoothly down to the main lobby, leaving the absolute burning wreckage of their toxic empire completely behind me. Exactly 1 week passed since I walked out of that courthouse lobby and left the absolute burning wreckage of their toxic empire completely behind me. The ensuing 7 days were a masterclass in rapid, catastrophic financial destruction. Bradley was entirely stripped of his unearned power. The swift and brutal efficiency of the federal government took over precisely where my corporate trap left off. By Wednesday morning, heavily armed FBI agents had raided his former executive office, confiscating every hard drive server and physical ledger. He was placed under an active, highly publicized federal investigation for massive wire fraud and illegal corporate embezzlement. Without his stolen executive salary, his artificially inflated bank accounts, and his limitless platinum credit cards, Bradley was suddenly and completely broke. He was a former tech titan reduced to begging his old junior developers for small cash loans just to buy basic groceries, but absolutely no one answered his desperate calls. The absolute clearest sign of his total ruin was the immediate, completely predictable departure of his pregnant mistress. The exact second Brittany realized the unlimited fountain of stolen corporate cash had permanently dried up, her profound, undying love for Bradley magically evaporated. She did not even bother to pack all of her expensive designer clothes. She simply gathered her illegally purchased diamond jewelry, hailed a cheap taxi, using the last few dollars in her personal checking account, and immediately fled across state lines to move back in with her parents. She completely abandoned Bradley to face the massive federal indictments entirely alone, permanently blocking his phone number before she even crossed the state border. Beatrice suffered an equally humiliating and devastating fate. She had arrogantly assumed my 24-hour eviction notice was a pathetic bluff. She spent her final night in the luxury downtown condominium, drinking expensive wine and aggressively complaining to Courtney. The next afternoon, the county sheriff arrived with two stern deputies and physically forced her out into the hallway. She was not allowed to pack her massive collection of couture dresses or her imported furniture. She was escorted out of the luxury high-rise, carrying only a single small suitcase, crying hysterically as the building concierge and several wealthy neighbors watched the entire spectacle in absolute disgust. With all of Bradley's accounts completely frozen and Courtney's fake wellness spa violently collapsing under massive vendor debt, Beatrice had absolutely nowhere to turn. The grand matriarch of the family was forced to rent a single dingy room in a completely run-down, poorly lit motel situated on the absolute outskirts of the city. She desperately attempted to reach out to her elite country club friends for financial salvation, but news of the massive federal embezzlement scandal had already spread like wildfire through their wealthy social circles. The women who had eagerly drank her catered champagne and loudly laughed at my plain clothes just a few days prior now completely shunned her. They entirely blocked her phone numbers, refusing to be associated with a highly toxic, destitute family of federal criminals. Their absolute collapse was utterly comprehensive, mathematically flawless, and perfectly deserved. Courtney, the final remaining pillar of their highly toxic family structure, experienced her own spectacular downfall exactly 2 days later. My elite team of forensic corporate auditors descended upon her absurdly overpriced wellness spa like a swarm of highly trained locusts. Because Bradley had illegally seeded her entirely unprofitable business using heavily embezzled corporate payroll reserves. The entire spa was legally classified as an illicit asset purchased with stolen capital. The auditors aggressively seized absolutely everything. They legally locked the heavy glass front doors, permanently froze her operating business accounts, and officially repossessed all of her expensive imported massage tables and completely useless crystal therapy machines to rapidly claw back the stolen funds. Courtney threw an absolutely massive screaming tantrum in the middle of the upscale outdoor strip mall. She aggressively stomped her designer heels and hurled crude, highly unprofessional insults at the stern federal agents executing the corporate seizure. But her dramatic public performance was completely useless against ironclad legal documentation. Jamal watched her humiliating public meltdown from a safe distance, completely disgusted by the sheer unbridled criminality of his entitled in-laws. He had spent years quietly suffering under their constant disrespect and casual financial abuse, playing the obedient husband, while Courtney blindly enabled her brother's massive ego. That afternoon, Jamal finally took absolute control of his life. He officially marched into the downtown family court and formally filed for immediate, irreconcilable divorce. Armed with the massive mountain of irrefutable financial evidence proving his wife was deeply complicit in an active, highly publicized federal wire fraud conspiracy, the family court judge did not hesitate for a single second. Jamal easily and rapidly won full primary legal and physical custody of their young child, completely and permanently removing his son from the highly toxic, destructive influence of that entire family. The following morning, I invited Jamal directly up to my private penthouse executive office. The expansive corporate suite was completely silent, perfectly bathed in bright natural sunlight streaming through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the entire financial district. Jamal stepped out of the private, secure elevator, looking visibly exhausted from the legal stress, but incredibly relieved. I stood up from my sleek glass desk and respectfully extended my hand. I presented him with a thick premium executive employment contract. I was not just offering him a standard corporate job to express my gratitude. I formally hired him as the global chief auditor for my entire multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. The legally binding contract completely doubled his previous senior corporate salary and included massive executive equity benefits, permanently securing his financial future and ensuring his young son would never want for anything. I looked directly into his tired but deeply hopeful eyes. Integrity pays off, Jamal, I said smoothly, giving his hand a firm, respectful shake. Welcome to the winning team. 2 weeks later, the sky above the financial district broke open, releasing a torrential, freezing downpour that perfectly mirrored the cold, ruthless reality of my new life. I walked purposefully out of the massive sliding glass doors of my corporate tower, the heavy collar of my tailored designer trench coat pulled up sharply against the biting wind. My private driver was already waiting at the curb, holding a large black umbrella open beside the sleek, armored town car. I stepped forward, eager to head back to my immaculate penthouse, when two pathetic, soaked figures aggressively lunged from the dark shadows of the concrete parking garage. I stopped instantly, my driver immediately stepping defensively between us. It was Bradley and Beatrice. They were entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, perfectly manicured monsters who had ruthlessly tormented me for 5 agonizing years. They looked utterly disheveled, deeply exhausted, and completely broken by the relentless, crushing weight of the federal justice system. Bradley was wearing a cheap, wrinkled raincoat, his face covered in patchy, unkempt stubble, his eyes wild and heavily bloodshot. Beatrice looked even worse. Her expensive salon blowout was completely ruined, her wet, thinning hair plastered flat against her pale, deeply sunken cheeks. Beatrice did not even hesitate. The former grand matriarch of the elite country club aggressively pushed past my driver and completely collapsed onto the wet, unforgiving concrete. She dropped directly to her knees in the freezing puddles, looking up at me with desperate, terrified eyes. Actual, genuine tears streamed rapidly down her wrinkled face, mixing entirely with the harsh rain. "Please, Megan." Beatrice openly sobbed, her voice a shrill, broken wail that barely pierced the loud sound of the raging storm. "We are family. You cannot do this to us. Please do not let my son go to federal prison. I will do absolutely anything you want. I will publicly apologize. I will scrub your floors. Just please make the federal agents stop." Bradley aggressively stepped forward, violently shivering in the cold wind. He looked at me with a pathetic, hollow expression of total defeat. "Megan, please." Bradley begged, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Just give me my executive position back. I will work for entry-level wages. I was just under a massive amount of corporate stress. The pressure was entirely destroying my mental health. I never meant to hurt you. Just call off the forensic auditors and let me fix this." I stood perfectly still under the large black umbrella, looking down at them with absolute, terrifyingly cold indifference. I felt zero pity. I felt absolutely no guilt. I looked at their shivering, ruined bodies and felt nothing but the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of a flawless execution. "Family actively protects each other," I stated smoothly, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy rain, like a freshly sharpened blade. "You actively chose to be parasitic leeches. You chose to maliciously destroy my life for your own pathetic financial gain. You dug this massive, inescapable grave entirely by yourselves. And for the record, Bradley, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, aggressively handles criminal wire fraud, not me. I am just a venture capitalist. Do not ever approach my corporate building again." I turned away from their miserable, pleading faces without a single second of hesitation. I stepped gracefully into the warm, luxurious leather interior of my waiting town car, completely ignoring Beatrice's hysterical wails. My driver smoothly shut the heavy door, instantly cutting off the pathetic sounds of their begging. The sleek car smoothly pulled away from the curb, splashing freezing water directly onto Bradley's cheap shoes. I watched them in the rearview mirror as they slowly shrank into the distance, completely abandoned in the cold, unforgiving rain. It was a flawless, exact parallel to how they had aggressively abandoned me, with absolutely nothing just a few months ago, entirely bringing their horrific cycle of abuse to a perfect, spectacular end. The following morning arrived with a brilliantly clear sky, the aggressive storm having washed the entire city completely clean. I sat comfortably behind the massive glass expanse of my executive desk, holding a warm cup of artisan coffee, simply watching the morning sun perfectly illuminate the sprawling skyline of the financial district. The towering steel skyscrapers and massive corporate headquarters stretching out before me were a profound testament to actual tangible creation. They were built on solid foundations, rigorous audits, and undeniable financial reality. Looking down at the bustling city streets, I felt a deep, resonant sense of profound peace. The journey over the last 5 years had been a masterclass in extreme patience. For half a decade, I played the highly specific, deeply demeaning role they actively forced upon me. I was the quiet, unremarkable suburban wife. I was the easy target for their relentless, petty cruelties. Beatrice Bradley and Courtney constantly underestimated me because they fundamentally judged human worth based entirely on their own highly toxic, intensely superficial standards. In their shallow, hollow world, power was loudly defined by heavily leveraged designer handbags, leased luxury vehicles, and aggressive social posturing at the local country club. They genuinely believed that because I did not wear massive, gaudy diamond necklaces or aggressively scream at service workers, I was inherently weak. They mistook my profound silence for absolute stupidity. They were living entirely in a carefully constructed fantasy. They spent their entire lives desperately projecting the glittering illusion of immense wealth while simultaneously drowning in a massive ocean of illicit debt and corporate fraud. They practically worshipped the shiny, expensive veneer of success, completely ignoring the rotting, highly unstable foundation holding it all up. I never bothered to correct their massive delusions. I realized very early on that the absolute best way to completely destroy a raging narcissist is to simply give them everything they demand and watch them eagerly crush themselves under the immense weight of their own unearned arrogance. I took a slow sip of my coffee, turning my leather chair to look at the massive physical ledger Jamal had left perfectly centered on my desk. It was a beautiful, mathematically flawless document that officially finalized the absolute liquidation of Bradley's former holding company. True power never actually needs to shout to be heard. It does not need to throw massive public tantrums in a courthouse hallway or aggressively sob in a freezing parking garage. True power operates in complete silence. It meticulously builds its vast empire deep in the shadows, carefully analyzing every single weakness, quietly purchasing the massive debts of its enemies, and positioning every single chess piece before the opponent even realizes a game is being played. True power executes its final strategy with absolute terrifying precision. I never needed to stoop to their embarrassing level of chaotic emotional warfare. I did not need to scream, I did not need to cry, and I certainly did not need to beg for basic human respect from a family of deeply parasitic thieves. I simply needed to maintain absolute emotional control. I let Bradley's massive, unchecked ego fully convince him that he was an invincible technological visionary. I let Beatrice's blinding entitlement completely isolate her from reality. I let them aggressively build their own highly complex corporate guillotine, and I simply waited for the perfect mathematically optimal moment to gracefully pull the heavy wooden lever. Their destruction was not an act of petty vengeance. It was simply the inevitable, highly calculated correction of a massive financial anomaly. The modern world is absolutely filled with loud, highly arrogant people desperately trying to mask their profound incompetence with aggressive bullying and toxic manipulation. They actively prey on empathy. They view basic kindness as an open invitation for financial and emotional exploitation. But they are incredibly fragile. Their entire existence relies entirely on the silent compliance of the people they actively abuse. The exact moment you stop playing their rigged game, their entire false reality violently shatters. I reclaimed my entire life, my profound dignity, and my massive financial empire by simply refusing to participate in their pathetic illusion. I legally bought the ground they walked on, and then I systematically pulled it out from directly under their expensive, unpaid shoes. I closed the heavy ledger and neatly placed it inside my secure filing cabinet. The air in the penthouse was completely still, perfectly quiet, and entirely mine. The toxic noise of Bradley and his miserable, ruined family was permanently silenced, replaced entirely by the smooth, continuous hum of a massive, globally successful enterprise moving aggressively into the future. I stood up, walked directly to the massive window, and pressed my hand against the cool glass, ready to conquer whatever challenge dared to present itself next. Never let loud, arrogant people convince you that your quiet dignity is a weakness. Have you ever had a mother-in-law or an ex who thought they held all the cards only to realize you owned the whole deck? How did you put them in their place? Tell me your story in the comments below. If my journey brought you satisfaction, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of women taking back their power. Until next time, stay strong and always protect your assets.